Penguin Random House Audio presents The Irishman, originally published as I Heard You Paint Houses, Frank the Irishman Sheeran and Closing the Case on Jimmy Hoffa by Charles Brandt. Read for you by Scott Brick.
Prologue. Russ and Frank. In a summer cottage by a lake, in a room full of tearful and anxious members of Jimmy Hoffa's family, the FBI found a yellow pad. Hoffa kept the pad next to his phone. On the pad, Hoffa had written in pencil, Russ and Frank. Russ and Frank were close friends and staunch allies of Jimmy Hoffa. The giant, iron-muscled Frank was so close and loyal to Jimmy throughout Jimmy's ordeals with the law and with Bobby Kennedy that Frank was thought of as family. On that day by the lake, the family in the room feared deep in their souls that only a very close friend, someone trusted, could have gotten near enough to harm a cautious, vigilant Jimmy Hoffa, a man who was keenly aware of his deadly enemies. And on that day, Russ and Frank, mob enforcer Frank the Irishman Sheeran and his godfather, Russell McGee Buffalino, became leading suspects in the most notorious disappearance in American history. Every book in serious study on the Hoffa disappearance has alleged that Frank the Irishman Sheeran, a staunch Hoffa supporter within the Teamsters, had turned on his friend and mentor. These studies allege that Sheeran was a conspirator and perpetrator, present when Hoffa was killed, and that the killing was sanctioned and planned by Russell McGee Buffalino. Among these studies are meticulously researched books, including The Hoffa Wars by investigative reporter Dan Moldea, The Teamsters by Court TV's founder Stephen Brill, and Hoffa by Professor Arthur Sloan. On September 7, 2001, more than 26 years after the mystery began, a family member who had been at the cottage by the lake sharing that terrifying time with his mother and his sister held a press conference. Hoffa's son, Teamsters President James P. Hoffa, had just had his hopes raised by a new development in his father's disappearance. The FBI revealed that a DNA test done on a strand of hair proved that Jimmy Hoffa had been inside a car long suspected of being used in the crime. Fox News' senior correspondent Eric Shawn asked James if his father could have been lured into that car by several of the other well-known suspects. James shook his head in response to each man on the list, and at the end said no, my father didn't know these people. When Shawn asked if Frank Sheeran could have lured his father into the car, James nodded his head and said yes, my father would have gotten into a car with him. In closing his press conference, James expressed to the media his wish that the case would be solved by a deathbed confession. At the time he made this request, Frank Sheeran was the only man among the original suspects who was still living and sufficiently aged to give a deathbed confession. The press conference took place 4 days before the tragic events of September 11, 2001. James P.'s scheduled appearance on Larry King Live for the next week was canceled. A month later, and with the Hoffa story crowded off the front page, Jimmy's only daughter, Judge Barbara Crancer, telephoned Frank Sheeran from her chambers in St. Louis. Judge Crancer, in the manner of her legendary father, got to the point pretty quickly and made a personal appeal to Sheeran to provide her family closure by telling what he knew about her father's disappearance. Do the right thing, she said to him. Following his attorney's advice, Sheeran revealed nothing and respectfully referred Barbara to his counsel. This wasn't the first time Judge Barbara Crancer had written or called the Irishman with the aim of unlocking the secrets in his soul. On March 6, 1995, Barbara had written Frank, "It is my personal belief that there are many people who called themselves loyal friends who know what happened to James R. Hoffa, who did it, and why. The fact that not one of them has ever told his family, even under a vow of secrecy, is painful to me. I believe you are one of those people." On October 25, 2001, a week after Barbara's telephone call, Frank the Irishman Sheeran, then in his 80s and using a walker to get around, heard a knock on the patio door of his ground-floor apartment. It was two young FBI agents. They were friendly, relaxed, and very respectful to this man nearing the end of his life. They were hoping he had softened with age, perhaps even repented. They were looking for that deathbed confession. They said they were too young to remember the case, but they had read thousands of pages of the file. They were upfront about the recent phone call Sheeran had received from Barbara, telling him straight out they had discussed the call with her. As he had done repeatedly since July 30th, 1975, the day Jimmy disappeared, Sheeran sadly directed the FBI agents to his lawyer, the former district attorney of Philadelphia, F. Emmett Fitzpatrick, Esquire. Failing to persuade Sheeran to cooperate and give a deathbed confession, the FBI announced on April 2, 2002, that it had turned over its complete 16,000-page file to the Michigan District Attorney and had released 1,330 pages of that file to the media and to Jimmy Hoffa's two children. There would be no federal charges. Finally, after nearly 27 years, the FBI had given up. On September 3, 2002, almost a year to the day after James P.'s press conference, the state of Michigan gave up too and closed its file, expressing continued condolences to the Hoffa children. In announcing his decision at a press conference, Michigan District Attorney David Gorsica was quoted as saying, "Unfortunately, this has the markings of a great whodunit novel without the final chapter." I Heard You Paint Houses is a whodunit, but it is not a novel. It is a history based on one-on-one interviews of Frank Sheeran, most of which were tape-recorded. I conducted the first interview in 1991 at Sheeran's apartment. Shortly after, my partner and I were able to secure Sheeran's premature release from jail on medical grounds. Immediately after that 1991 session, Sheeran had second thoughts about the interrogative nature of the interview process and terminated it. He had admitted far more than he was happy with. I told him to get back in touch with me if he changed his mind and was willing to submit to my questioning. In 1999, Sheeran's daughters arranged a private audience for their aging and physically disabled father with Monsignor Heldefer of St. Dorothy's Church in Philadelphia. Sheeran met with the Monsignor, who granted Sheeran absolution for his sins so that he could be buried in a Catholic cemetery. Frank Sheeran said to me, "I believe there is something after we die. If I got a shot at it, I don't want to lose that shot. I don't want to close the door." Following his audience with the Monsignor, Sheeran contacted me, and at Sheeran's request I attended a meeting at his lawyer's office. At the meeting, Sheeran agreed to submit to my questioning, and the interviews began again and continued for 4 years. I brought to the interview process my experiences as a former homicide and death penalty prosecutor, a lecturer on cross-examination, a student of interrogation, and the author of several articles on the U.S. Supreme Court's exclusionary rule regarding confessions. "You're worse than any cop I ever had to deal with," Sheeran said to me once. I spent countless hours just hanging around with the Irishman, meeting alleged mob figures, driving to Detroit to locate the scene of the Hoffa disappearance, driving to Baltimore to find the scene of 2 underworld deliveries made by Sheeran, meeting with Sheeran's lawyer, and meeting his family and friends, intimately getting to know the man behind the story. I spent countless hours on the phone and in person, prodding and picking away at the storehouse of material that formed the basis of this book. More often than not, the first rule in a successful interrogation is to have faith that the subject truly wants to confess, even when he is denying and lying. This was the case with Frank Sheeran. The second rule is to keep the subject talking, and that was never a problem with the Irishman either. Let the words flow, and the truth finds its own way out. Some part of Frank Sheeran had been wanting to get this story off his chest for a long time. In 1978, there had been a controversy about whether Sheeran had confessed over the phone, perhaps while he was under the influence of alcohol, to Stephen Brill, author of The Teamsters. The FBI believed Sheeran had confessed to Brill and pressured Brill for the tape. Dan Moldea, author of the Hoffa Wars, wrote in an article that
Sample complete. Ready to continue?